The crystal chandelier in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel looked like a frozen waterfall, catching the light from 100 cameras. My heels clicked softly against the polished marble as I walked toward the VIP section, adjusting the strap of my silk dress. Everyone who was anyone in Atlanta's black elite had showed up for my father's annual charity gala. Marcus Vance was a man people didn't say no to. He was a billionaire real estate mogul, a pillar of the community, and according to the plaque on the wall, a saint. I had spent my entire life trying to make him proud, working 80 hours a week as the director of his youth foundation. But tonight, I wasn't thinking about the applause or the jazz band playing softly near the stage. I was thinking about a spreadsheet on my laptop. 2 days ago, I found a hole in the foundation's accounting books. $2 million, meant for upgrading inner-city school libraries, had simply vanished into an offshore account registered in Delaware. When I asked our chief financial officer about it, he turned pale and told me to talk to my father. I spotted Marcus standing near the ice sculpture, laughing with a city councilman. He looked exactly like the man the media loved, tall, impeccably dressed in a custom tuxedo, with a warm smile that made people feel like they were the only person in the room. As I got closer, the silver charm bracelet on my left wrist let out a soft metallic chime. It was a cheap, tarnished piece of metal with a tiny crescent moon charm. I had owned it for as long as I could remember. My mother always told me it was a lucky piece found in my crib when I was a baby, and even though it didn't match my designer outfit, I never took it off. It was my only habit. Marcus saw me approaching and his smile widened, though his eyes stayed completely flat. He patted my shoulder, introducing me to the councilman as his brilliant daughter, the future of the Vance empire. I waited for the politician to walk away before I leaned closer to my father. The music seemed to fade into a low hum. My heart was thumping against my ribs, but I kept my voice low, hoping we could step into a private room. I asked him about the Delaware account and the missing $2 million. The warmth drained from his face so fast it felt like a temperature drop in the room. He didn't say a word. Instead, he grabbed my elbow with a grip that left bruises through my sleeve and pulled me toward the center stage where the microphone stood. The crowd began to quiet down, expecting a touching father-daughter toast. Marcus picked up the microphone, his voice booming through the speakers, steady and cold. He announced to the entire room that effective immediately, I was being terminated from the foundation for gross incompetence and financial misconduct. The room went completely silent. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning. I stared at him, my mouth open, waiting for him to laugh or say it was a joke. But he wasn't looking at me. He looked directly at the reporters in the front row. He said he was stripping me of my inheritance and cutting me out of his will entirely, effective tonight. He called me an ungrateful child who had tried to sabotage his legacy. A camera flashed, the light burning my eyes. Someone in the back whispered loudly. I looked over at my mother, who was sitting at the head table. She didn't look up from her plate. She just kept cutting her chicken, her face like a marble mask. No one stepped forward. No one said a word. The people who had been laughing at my jokes 10 minutes ago suddenly found the floor very interesting. I turned and walked toward the exit, my legs shaking so badly I could barely keep my balance. The security guards at the door, men I had known by name for 5 years, didn't look me in the eye as they opened the doors for me. The humid Atlanta night air hit my face like a wet towel. I stood on the sidewalk, waiting for the valet to bring my car, but instead, the manager walked out with a small plastic bag containing my keys. He told me the vehicle was registered under the corporate name and had already been flagged for repossession. By Monday morning, the world had shrunk to the size of a broken smartphone screen. The tabloids had a field day with the story. The headlines called me a greedy heiress caught skimming from orphans. My face was all over local blogs. When I tried to log into my bank app to pay for a cab, a red box popped up stating the account was restricted by the primary holder. My credit cards were declined at a convenience store when I tried to buy a bottle of water. I had to leave my apartment in Buckhead within 48 hours because the lease was under Vance Enterprises. The property manager stood in the hallway with 2 police officers while I packed my life into 3 suitcases. I called my mother 14 times. Every call went straight to voicemail. On the 15th try, a generic automated voice informed me that the number had been changed. I ended up in a tiny, 1-bedroom apartment in Bankhead, a part of the city my father's company usually targeted for demolition. The walls were painted a dull yellow that was peeling at the corners. The window looked out onto an alley where a dumpster leaked green fluid onto the asphalt. At night, the traffic from the nearby highway kept me awake, a low, angry roar that never stopped. I sold my designer clothes and bags to a consignment shop online just to cover the first month's rent and some groceries. All I had left was my old college laptop and my graphic design skills. I started bidding for low-paying freelance jobs on public forums, designing logos for plumbing businesses and lawn care companies for $50 apiece. One afternoon, a client canceled a $300 project after the logo was already finished. The email was short. It said they ran my name through Google and couldn't risk having their brand associated with a financial criminal. I stared at the screen for a long time. The silver crescent moon on my wrist clicked against the laptop keyboard. I didn't cry. I just closed the laptop and stared at the water stain on the ceiling. 3 weeks into my new life, a black Lincoln town car pulled up outside my building. It looked completely out of place next to the rusted sedans and broken glass on the street. 2 men in charcoal suits got out, carrying leather briefcases. They didn't look like reporters. They looked like federal prosecutors or corporate lawyers from the top floor of a midtown tower. When the knock came on my door, I kept the chain link on. The older man held up a laminated identification card. He said his name was Arthur Pendleton, a senior partner at a probate law firm. He said they were here regarding an estate audit connected to the late Judge Clarence Ncube. I told him he had the wrong apartment. I didn't know anyone named Ncube. The lawyer didn't lower his card. He looked through the crack of the door and asked if my mother was Evelyn Vance. When I nodded, he sighed, a sound full of old exhaustion. He said they had been looking for me for a very long time, and that I needed to open the door because my entire life was based on a fraud that went back 26 years. The air inside the apartment felt instantly thick. I unlatched the chain and let them in. They didn't look around at the stained carpet or the cheap folding chair. They sat down at my small kitchen table, opening a thick manila folder that smelled like old paper and vinegar. Arthur pulled out a document with a state seal on it. He told me that during a routine compliance audit of a defunct private hospital in South Atlanta, they discovered a set of sealed medical records that didn't match the state database. He looked at me with a professional, unblinking gaze. He told me that a DNA profile had been extracted from a medical procedure I had done as a child for an appendectomy, which was still on file in the state record system. He slid a paper across the table. It was a genetic comparison report. At the bottom, the match percentage between myself and Marcus Vance was 0. The match percentage between myself and Evelyn Vance was also 0. The room seemed to tilt. I pointed at the paper, my voice coming out as a dry rasp. I told him it was a forgery, that my father might hate me enough to frame me for theft, but he couldn't change reality. The younger lawyer reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, clear plastic evidence bag. Inside was an old hospital crib card from 2000, yellowed with age, bearing the name Baby Girl Ncube. Arthur leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. He said 26 years ago, a prominent black physician named Dr. David Ncube and his wife Clara had their newborn daughter abducted from the nursery of the regional hospital. The case had gone cold after 6 months. The nurse on duty had vanished, and the security footage from that night had mysteriously corrupted. He told me my real name was Nandi Ncube. My fingers went to the silver bracelet on my wrist. I looked down at the tiny crescent moon charm. My voice shook as I asked them how they could possibly know that this wasn't just a mix-up at the lab. Arthur pointed to the plastic bag. On the back of the crib card, typed in faded blue ink, was a description of the infant's personal items left in the bassinet. It listed a single silver charm bracelet with a crescent moon motif, provided by the maternal grandmother. The room went completely dark around the edges. The small ceiling fan above us hummed, spinning lazily, chopping the hot air into heavy pieces. The truth didn't feel like a sudden revelation. It felt like a heavy weight settling behind my eyes, making it hard to look at the walls of the room I had been living in. Everything I thought I knew about my identity, from the way I held my fork to the history of the family I thought I belonged to, had been erased in 5 minutes by a man with a leather briefcase. The drive to Savannah took 4 hours. I didn't take a train or a bus. The lawyers had arranged a car for me, a quiet sedan that smelled like new leather. As the city of Atlanta faded into flat pine woods and gray overpasses, I watched the digital clock on the dashboard tick away the minutes of my old life. We pulled into the parking lot of a small, red brick community clinic on the outskirts of the city. The sign out front read Ncube Family Health Center. It wasn't impressive. The paint on the window frames was flacking, and a line of elderly people and mothers holding toddlers stood outside the door, waiting for the afternoon shift to start. There were no limestone pillars or private security guards like the ones at my father's estate. I got out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel. My hands were tucked deep into the pockets of my jacket, hiding the trembling. Arthur walked me through the side entrance, past a small reception desk where a nurse was speaking softly into a phone. At the end of the hallway, an office door opened. A man in a faded blue lab coat stepped out, holding a chart. He had gray hair at his temples and deep lines around his eyes, but when he looked up and saw me, his hands dropped to his sides. The chart hit the linoleum floor with a sharp slap, the papers scattering across the ground. A woman stepped out behind him, wearing scrubs and a stethoscope around her neck. She took one look at my face, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't scream or cry out. She just covered her mouth with both hands, her shoulders shaking instantly. For 30 seconds, nobody moved. The sound of a child crying in the waiting room came through the drywall, distant and thin. Then, Clara Ncube walked toward me, her steps hesitant, as if she thought I might disappear if she moved too fast. When she reached me, she didn't ask for identification or a document. She just reached out and touched my cheek with a palm that felt rough from years of washing with clinic soap. She whispered a name I had never heard anyone call me before, Nandi. When her arms went around my shoulders, she pulled me into an embrace that felt completely different from the stiff, polite hugs my adoptive mother used to give me at holidays. She smelled like peppermint and lavender. Dr. Ncube came over, his large, warm hands wrapping around both of us, his chest rising and falling against my back as he let out a long, ragged sob. We sat in his small office for hours while the sun went down outside, casting long orange shadows across the medical textbooks and framed diplomas on the wall. They told me about the night I disappeared. They told me how they had spent their entire savings on private investigators who did nothing but take their money and disappear. They told me how they had kept my room exactly the same for 10 years before they finally had to move to this smaller house to fund the clinic. They didn't ask me about the Vance family fortune or the scandal in the newspapers. When I tried to explain the missing $2 million and why my father had publicly humiliated me, Dr. Ncube just took my hand, his thumb rubbing over the silver crescent moon charm on my bracelet. He told me that none of that mattered because I was sitting in his office, and that was the only audit that meant anything to him. The legal machinery moved quickly once the DNA results were entered into the state database. Within a week, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation opened a criminal inquiry into the 2000 abduction. It didn't take long for the house of cards to fall apart. A retired nurse named Agatha Moyo, who was living in a hospice facility in Macon, was visited by state investigators. Facing terminal illness, she signed an affidavit that blew the case wide open. The document was leaked to the press 3 days later. According to the statement, Evelyn Vance had delivered a stillborn baby girl at the private hospital hours before I was born. Terrified of Marcus's reaction, a man who had already threatened to divorce her if she didn't produce an heir to secure a family trust, Evelyn had panicked. She paid Agatha $50,000 in cash to find a replacement child from the clinic nursery. The child they took was the daughter of a young resident doctor named David Ncube. The news hit the Atlanta social scene like an earthquake. The same blogs that had dragged my name through the mud now carried front-page features with old photos of Marcus and Evelyn alongside the mugshot of the nurse. The Vance Enterprises stock dropped 12% in 48 hours as major institutional investors pulled their funding from the luxury developments in Midtown. I watched the news from the small living room of my parents' house in Savannah. I felt a strange numbness spreading through my chest. The woman who had taught me how to sew, the man who had bought me my first car and walked me through my high school graduation, they weren't my parents. They were my captors. Every memory I had of my childhood felt like a vintage photograph that had been dipped in ink. The local prosecutor didn't waste time. Evelyn Vance was arrested at her home in Buckhead on charges of first-degree kidnapping, conspiracy, and custodial interference. The television showed her walking down her driveway in handcuffs, a beige coat pulled over her head to hide her face from the cameras. Marcus wasn't in the footage. His lawyers issued a statement claiming he had absolutely no knowledge of his wife's actions 26 years ago and was fully cooperating with the authorities. The trial took place in the Fulton County Superior Court 3 months later. The courtroom was packed to capacity with reporters, legal observers, and members of the city's old elite who wanted to see the final fall of the Vance dynasty. I sat on the hard wooden bench in the front row, flanked by David and Clara Ncube. Across the aisle, Evelyn sat at the defense table, looking frail and small without her usual jewelry and tailored suits. Her gray hair was pulled back into a simple knot, and she kept her eyes fixed on the legal yellow pad in front of her. Marcus was seated 3 rows behind her, surrounded by 4 defense attorneys, his face completely expressionless. When my name was called, the room went so quiet you could hear the scratch of the journalists' pens on their notebooks. I walked up to the witness stand, my white dress rustling against the wood. I took the oath, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. The prosecutor asked me to describe my relationship with the defendants. I didn't look at Marcus. I looked at Evelyn. I told the court about the foundation, about the missing $2 million, and about the night at the gala. I told them how I had been thrown out onto the street like trash by the people I called my parents. Then the defense attorney stood up for cross-examination. He tried to suggest that I was a bitter former employee using a family tragedy to get revenge for being cut out of a billionaire's will. He asked me if I hated the woman who raised me. I looked at Evelyn. For the first time all day, she looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with a desperate, pleading look. I remembered the time she stayed up with me when I had the flu, reading me stories until her voice went hoarse. I also remembered the coldness in her eyes when she watched me walk out of the Plaza Hotel into the dark. I turned to the judge. I told him I didn't hate her. I told him that hatred took too much energy, and I needed all my energy to figure out who Nandi Ncube was. I said that justice didn't need anger to work. It just needed the truth to be recorded in the court books. Evelyn covered her face and began to sob, her shoulders heaving against her cheap blouse. The judge called for a brief recess. When court resumed, Evelyn's attorney announced that his client wished to change her plea to guilty on all counts. The judge didn't delay sentencing. He noted the gravity of the crime, the 26 years of stolen life, and the pain inflicted on the Ncube family. He sentenced Evelyn Vance to 5 years in a federal penitentiary. Then he turned his attention to Marcus Vance. While there wasn't enough evidence to charge him with the initial kidnapping, the financial audit of his foundation had revealed massive tax fraud and money laundering connected to that offshore account in Delaware. The judge ordered all personal and corporate assets of Vance Enterprises to remain frozen indefinitely pending a federal investigation. But the final blow came from the probate records. The judge took off his glasses and looked at the crowded room. He stated that under Georgia inheritance law, a child who was integrated into a family through criminal abduction has no legal standing as an heir. But since the Vance Foundation had merged its assets with a municipal trust fund that originally belonged to the late Judge Clarence Ncube, Clara's father, the legal ownership of that charitable fund was now contested. He announced that by blood and by explicit provision of the original 1998 Ncube Family Trust, the sole rightful executor of the combined medical charity fund, valued at $80 million, was Nandi Ncube. The courtroom erupted into a loud roar of whispers and gasps. Marcus Vance stood up so fast his chair fell backward against the mahogany railing. His face was purple, his mouth moving as he tried to shout something at his lawyers, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of the judge's gavel hitting the block over and over again. I didn't take the money to buy a mansion or a sports car. I stayed in Savannah for another year, living in the small room my parents had kept for me. We took that $80 million fund and completely restructured it. We removed the Vance name from every building and every document. We created the Nandi Project. We used the capital to build 3 new state-of-the-art community clinics in South Atlanta, East Savannah, and rural Georgia, providing free pediatric care and legal advocacy for families who had lost children to the system or through illegal separations. The local media started calling me Atlanta's Phoenix, a name that made me laugh because I didn't feel like a mythical bird. I just felt like someone who had cleaned out a dirty basement. One evening, as I was closing up the Savannah clinic, a regular taxi pulled into the lot. An old man got out of the back seat. He was wearing a gray suit that looked too big for him, his skin sallow and his gait unsteady. He used a wooden cane to walk across the gravel. It was Marcus Vance. The federal government had seized his towers, his cars, and his accounts. He was living in a small rented house in Augusta while his legal team tried to keep him out of prison for the tax fraud charges. He stood in the doorway of the clinic, his chest heaving as he looked at the logo on the wall, the silhouette of a girl holding a crescent moon. He looked at me, his eyes watery, his lips trembling. He said he didn't know about Evelyn's secret. He said he truly believed I was his daughter and that he was sorry for what happened at the gala. He reached out a hand, his fingers shaking. I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to shrink or apologize for my existence. I didn't feel the old fear of his anger. I walked over and placed my hand on his shoulder. My silver bracelet let out a soft, clear chime in the quiet hallway. I told him he may have stolen my beginning, but he couldn't touch my ending. I told him I had forgiven him a long time ago, not for his sake, but because I didn't want to carry his garbage in my heart. I said I just couldn't save the man he was. He looked down at his shoes, nodded once, and walked back to the taxi without another word. Tonight, the Grand Hall of the Savannah Civic Center is filled with 300 people for our first annual fundraising dinner. The tables are decorated with simple white candles and green ivy. There are no corporate sponsors or politicians looking for votes. There are just families from the neighborhood, nurses from our clinics, and the 2 people who never stopped looking for me. I stand backstage, looking at my reflection in the mirror. I am wearing a simple white linen gown, my hair natural, my face clear. I don't look like the girl in the emerald dress from the Plaza Hotel. When they announce my name, the applause is warm and steady, like rain on a tin roof. I walk out onto the stage, the silver crescent moon charm on my wrist catching the spotlight. I look out at the crowd, and I feel a deep, quiet peace that no bank account or billionaires could ever buy. They took my name, my bloodline, and my inheritance, but they could never touch my purpose. But as I look out at all of you tonight, I have to ask a question that has been keeping me awake during the quiet hours in the clinic. If the truth hadn't come out through a corporate audit, if I had stayed in that billionaire's house and never discovered the fraud, would I still be the same person I am today? Can a life built entirely on a cruel lie ever produce something truly good? Or does the stain of the beginning always find a way to corrupt the end?